So I'd like to introduce Dr. Juan Carlos Hidalgo. He's an independent policy analyst based in Washington, D.C. He's a weekly columnist for La Nación, Costa Rica's most influential newspaper, and his articles have been published in the International New York Times, USA Today, World and News Report, Miami Herald, Forbes, Huffington Post, and other leading Spanish-speaking newspapers, such as El País from Spain, La Nación from Argentina, El Tiempo from Colombia, El Mercurio from Chile. He regularly appears as a commentator on international networks such as CNN, in Español, Al Jazeera, Voice of America, France 24, and a variety of other TV and radio outlets in the US, Europe, and Latin America. Hidalgo received his BA in International Relations from the Universidad Nacional in Costa Rica and holds a master's degree in International Commerce and Policy from George Mason University, and he's a member of the Mont Pelerin Society. Would you join me in welcoming Juan Carlos Hidalgo to his talk?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here at Mackenzie University to discuss a topic that is very important for Brazil and very important for the region, which is the impact that corruption has on poverty in the region. As you might know, if you look at the news, not only here in Brazil, but all over Latin America, corruption is one of the biggest challenges, one of the biggest problems that we face in the region. There is not a single country in Latin America that hasn't been shaken by a major corruption scandal in the last 5 years. Actually, I was in Mexico a couple of years ago, some years ago, and somebody asked me, did you see that they arrested the governor, the corrupt governor from the PRI? And I asked, which one? And they say, Duarte. And I say, which one? Because there were actually two Duarte governors from the PRI that were arrested for corruption. One of them was arrested for stealing $2 billion from his state. Just imagine, just a governor, $2 billion. So you see Argentina, you see Peru, you see Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Venezuela, all over the place, corruption is a major issue. And what we have witnessed in the last years is that in some countries, the institutions are coping or responding in a much better way than in other countries regarding these corruption scandals. But the topic is, what's the impact that corruption has on poverty? So first, let's look at how poverty has been doing in the world in the last 70 years. It's been doing pretty well. I mean, from a perspective that is actually decreasing dramatically. As you can see, in 1950s, over 0.5% of the world population were living under what the World Bank considers extreme poverty, that is $1.25 a day, and that number has decreased significantly, particularly starting in 1980. And in 1980 on, something amazing happened, something that we won't see again ever in the history of humanity, which is that 800 million Chinese left poverty in just one generation. That's something that won't repeat itself again. And that has had tremendous impact the world over. Actually, the latest numbers from the World Bank show that poverty now is under 10% of the world population, extreme poverty again. And there is some discussions, although I think they're not necessarily realistic, that we might witness in our lifetime a world without extreme poverty. That's going to be a challenge. The pockets that remain are going to be really difficult to tackle because they're mostly in countries that are failed states, and fighting poverty there is going to be very difficult. However, it's amazing that we're actually having this conversation. When back 70 years ago, after World War II, most of the planet lived in extreme poverty. So now that we have witnessed that poverty is falling dramatically, we need to find out why, what has been taking place that explains this pattern. So a group of economists led by David Dollar, a group of economists from the World Bank, in 2013 published this paper. And they looked at the last 40 years, and they looked at the incomes of people in 118 countries in the last 40 years. But they pay particular attention to the bottom 40% of the population, the poorest 40%. And of course, they noticed that in most countries, the incomes of the poorest were rising, as well as the incomes of most people around the world. So they tried to figure out what exactly was behind the rise in the incomes of the poor. And they came to the conclusion that more than three quarters of the improvement in the income of the poorest 40% in 118 countries had been the result of economic growth, not redistributive programs. Because some people could claim that the advance that the humanity has experienced on poverty in the last 70 years has to do with the rise of the welfare state. Now we have states that have more resources, that spend more money on healthcare, on education, on programs such as Bolsa Familia, and so on, and that's why we have this dramatic fall in poverty levels around the world. Well, that's not the case. What these researchers, economists, found was that it is economic growth, the leading factor behind the drop in poverty. Yes, social programs, redistributive programs play a role, but it's not by far the main factor behind this phenomenon. The authors also found that there is a one-on-one relationship between economic growth and the income of the poorest 40% of the population. That is, that if you live in a country that grows 2% a year, the income on average of the poorest 40% grows 2% a year. If you live in a country that grows 5% a year, the income of the poorest 40% grows on average 5%. This is why economic growth is so important, because it's the best anti-poverty program that humanity has ever come up with. Going back to corruption, it's interesting if you look at what the literature defines as corruption, because there is always a debate whether corruption only happens in the public sector or corruption can also happen in the private sector. Well, according to the literature, corruption is the abuse of public power for private gain. And I emphasize the term public power because as we see in different definitions, it is for something to be counted as corruption, at least one of the parties must have a position in the public sector. So it is seen as something different from crimes that only involve agents in the private sector. That's a different sort of crime. But corruption in that regard means a form of favoritism in the exercise of public power. You have to have at least one agent involved in the public sector for it to be corruption. What's the impact of corruption on poverty and inequality? In 1998, the IMF published a paper that looked at different factors that impact poverty and inequality and tried to figure out what was the role of corruption in these. Well, they found that there is not only a positive correlation, very strong correlation between corruption and poverty and inequality, but there is a causal relationship between corruption and these two other problems. Why? Corruption decreases economic growth and therefore impacts poverty reduction. So the link on why corruption is bad for for poverty is because, again, it decreases economic growth. And as we have seen, economic growth is the leading cause for poverty reduction the world over. Corruption also distorts the efficient allocation of state resources in favor of the well-off and the well-connected. As we have seen, even though economic growth explains 3/4 of the reduction of poverty in the last 40 years, there is also 23% or so that is explained by redistributive social programs. Well, corruption impacts the efficient allocation of those state resources in social programs. So it has a twofold effect when it comes to poverty. Interestingly, the paper adopts a broad definition of corruption, which includes legal practices such as tax exemptions to powerful lobbies and government subsidies to well-off sectors of society. And this is very important because according to this paper, corruption is not only illegal acts, but it's also legal acts. When state resources are directed to groups of society that don't need them, and they're just getting subsidies or tax exemptions because they are well connected and they're powerful. This leads us to the classic definition that Frederic Bastiat gave us back in the 19th century. He said that when plunder has become a way of life for a group of men living together in society, they create for themselves in the course of time a legal system that authorizes it and a moral code that glorifies it. That is, in some societies, such as Latin America, corruption is a legal framework. Yes, we see illegal corruption lately, and that's been in the news, people stealing funds and asking for bribes and inflated contracts and all. But then you have also lots of examples of corruption, things that would be called corruption, that are perfectly legal because, they have been codified as legal by the people who are benefiting from this. For example, in Costa Rica, justices the justice of the Supreme Court receive ridiculous pensions when they retire. They can retire when they're 50 and receive a pension of $15,000 a month. And then they can retire at 50 and continue working in the private sector, open a private practice, and they will receive pensions, ridiculous pensions of $50,000 a month that they didn't contribute to, and work in the private sector where they're very much in demand. So that's corruption, but that's legal. And we have to keep in mind that according to this paper in particular, that is a reason why we have to take a look at legal corruption. So keeping in mind that there are societies where corruption has been legalized, let's look at this book that was making the rounds earlier this decade by Daron Acemoglu and James Robertson, and this is Why Nations Fail, and they looked at what explains development and poverty and wealth around the world, and they found that it has to do with a country's economic institutions. Of course, that's nothing new. Many people, since the beginning of economic theory, economic as a science, have been talking about the importance of institutions. The interesting thing is that they identified two sets of institutions. They talk about inclusive institutions, which are secure property rights, an independent judiciary, and public services and regulations that guarantee a level playing field, and extractive institutions, which are designed by the political powerful elites to extract resources from the rest of societies. So again, in one set of countries, you have institutions that protect people, that guarantee a fair play, whereas in others, corruption has been institutionalized, has been legalized. And they point at a very telling example, very graphic example, which is Nogales. Nogales is a city divided in two countries. Nogales, Mexico, in Sonora, and Nogales in Arizona. But it's interesting because even though these are the same people, the same race, the same demographic makeup, you know, the same religion, exposed to the same weather, because some people claim that people in the tropics are lazier or whatever. No, this is the same people. They're just divided by a wall. But if you look at the north, people have much better lives than people in the south. They have triple the average income, they have higher life expectancy, higher educational levels and lower school dropout rate, access to quality public services, lower crime rate, and a functional democracy. This is the same Nogaleños just divided by a wall. The same could be said now that we're a few days from the anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall about Eastern Germany and Western Germany, and differences that have remained and still in place 30 years after the wall fell. So definitely institutions are key to determine economic development. If you look at Brazil and the United States, you will notice that they were much different back in the 1800s, early 1800s, early years of the U.S. Republic. Brazil wasn't an independent country yet, but you see that their differences in GDP per capita and income were much greater. However, the prevalence of institutions, in the one case, inclusive institutions in the United States, in the other case, extractive institutions in Brazil, explain now that the difference between both countries is staggering. So, which countries are less corrupt? Daniel Treisman has two papers that were very well known on this topic. The first paper, which is this one, was done on base of perceptions of corruption. You know, there are a couple of indices and rankings out there that, like Transparency International, for example, and there is another one from the World Bank and the World Economic Forum, where they ask people, how corrupt do you think your country is? And that's one of the ways that they measure corruption. However, this metric can be very flawed because perceptions can be wrong. I mean, some people could actually claim that corruption now is worse in Brazil than 5 years ago, just because corruption has been exposed, but not necessarily is the case that corruption now is worse. But based on perceptions of corruption, he took a look at which countries are less corrupt, and he found that countries that are economically developed, that are long-established liberal democracies, countries that have a free and widely read press, countries that have a high share of women in Congress, and this is something that us classical liberals, which we don't usually entertain the idea of positive discrimination in lists, you know, in election lists and other stuff, well, maybe we should reconsider that. The more women we have in government, apparently the better for corruption, although you don't precisely, but here in Brazil, maybe I don't know. And a history of openness to trade. And then there are negative factors that impact corruption according to this paper: dependence on fuel exports, intrusive regulations, and unpredictable inflation. If you are familiar with the Economic Freedom of the World Report and the concept of economic freedom, several of these factors are already, boom, making a blink in your mind, probably. Treisman published another paper a few years later where instead of using perceptions of corruption, he used experiences of corruption. That is, there are also some surveys out there in different countries where they ask people, have you paid a bribe in the last year? So instead of being a perception, this is a reality. And particularly in democracies where people are not afraid to speak up, it's a very good metric to measure corruption. So using that metric, using that the reality of experience of corruption, some of the factors that Treisman found in the first paper remain. Yes, economically developed countries are less corrupt, long-established democracies, free and widely pressed, but the other ones weren't particularly strong in their correlation. And intrusive regulations remain. And you don't have to be an expert on corruption to see why intrusive regulations is a particular factor for creating the conditions for corruption. So, can we fight poverty? Going back to the subtopic of poverty, can we fight poverty in Latin America giving more money to the state, which some people claim that the only way that we can make more progress reducing poverty is having more a generous welfare state? Well, usually this narrative comes also mainly from international organizations such as the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank and so on. However, the Inter-American Development Bank published this book last year where they look at public spending in Latin America. And they found that government inefficiencies in government expenditure represent a waste of 4.4% of Latin America's GDP, which is more or less the size of the economy of Chile. Of course, there is government waste all over the place, but the main sources of waste are public procurement, that is when governments buy stuff, either services or when they enter public-private initiatives to build infrastructure, transfer to sectors of the population that don't need them, and again, this is one of the definitions of corruption according to the first paper that I mentioned in the IMF, and public sector wages. Public sector employees being paid very generous welfare wages that are not in accordance with the economic reality of the country. The book says that public expenditure in Latin America and the Caribbean grew on average 7 percentage points during the past 20 years, an increase that unfortunately is not reflected in a similar increase in quality, physical and human capital or lasting social outcomes. The main conclusion of this research, of this investigation by the Inter-American Development Bank is that no, we don't need to give governments more money. They already have been getting a lot of money and they're wasting it in a splendid way. If you look at country by country, Argentina is leading the pack when it comes to waste, 7% of GDP, and Brazil, well, it's actually mid-table, less than mid-table, less than the Latin American average, with almost 4% of GDP. As you can see, both leakage in transfers and procurement waste are where most of the inefficiencies can be found in Brazil. I will guess that leakage in transfer has to do a lot with the pension system and the public sector wages over here, and of course, procurement is a big problem here. So we shouldn't be surprised that there is a lot of inefficiency in government spending. Milton Friedman was the one that came out with this framework on how to see the efficiency of spending. So when you are spending your own money on yourself, well, you tend to be prudent. You know, you watch your wallet, but you try to look for the best quality of spending. You read all the reviews on Amazon, and you read all the opinions of people out there because you're trying to get the best quality at the best price. However, when you're spending your own money on others, you're still watching what you spend. You're still looking at the price tag, but you're not paying that much attention to quality. You don't spend hours looking at reviews and all that stuff. When you're spending other people's money on you, well, of course, you want the best quality for the money, but you don't look at the price tag. You're just indulging yourself with other people's money. And then you have the worst of all worlds, which is when others are spending the money of others. then you're not looking at price tags, you're not looking at quality, you're not prudent, and that's exactly where government is, where people don't care about how money is spent, whether efficiently or not. In Latin America, we have been sold in certain political sectors, we have been sold the idea that there is a model out there that works, and it's Scandinavia. Scandinavian countries have big governments, and if you look effectively, you see that the taxes are high, and spending is over 50% of GDP in most cases, and they're efficient, and they always come up in all the rankings as one of the happiest countries in the world, best places to live. So we have been told here in Latin America that we can aspire to be Scandinavian. If only we give more money to the politicians, to the government, we will become Swedish. We will become Finnish. Of course, that doesn't apply here in Brazil. You already give to the government as much money as people in Finland do, and you're not at all close to be people like Finnish here, you know, no offense. But that shows how ridiculous this argument is. As you can see, spending has been going up in every single country in Latin America in the last 20 years, 25 years. In Brazil, spending was 38% more or less in 1995. Now it's over 45%. Of GDP, at least in 2015, and we see that that has been the case. Look at dramatic increases in Ecuador, in Argentina, in Bolivia, and those countries are not necessarily better off now. So, of course, that the Scandinavian pipe dream or unicorn that some people try to sell us escapes an elemental question. And that's why I want to bring up this quote by James Buchanan, Nobel Economics Prize winner, and Richard Wagner. They wrote that any analysis that is divorced from institutional reality is at best an interesting intellectual exercise. We have to understand the institutions of a country in order to make a valid analysis. So if you give more money to the government in Brazil, you're not going to have the same effects, the same results that you're going to have if you give more money to the government of Finland. So you have to understand the institutional reality, the institutional context of each country in order to pursue public policy. So you probably have been already discussing the Economic Freedom of the World Report. I know that Mackenzie does a lot of work on this all over the year. You know the components of the index, the way that economic freedom is measured, size of government, legal system and property rights, sound money, freedom to trade international, and regulations. Look at how these are all factors that were mentioned in the previous papers about what makes a country less corrupt or more corrupt. Legal system, you know, independent judiciary, sound money, inflation was mentioned, open and international trade, and regulations. Of course, this is nothing new. The question that gave birth to economics as a social science was precisely what makes nations rich. Adam Smith tackled it in 1755, and he wrote in his notes, "Little else is requisite to carry a state to the highest degree of opulence from the lowest barbarism, but peace, easy taxes, and a tolerable administration of justice, all the rest being brought about by the natural course of things." Of course, Adam Smith wasn't inventing an ideology. He wasn't an ideologue. He was just explaining what his observations about what made nation rich were. And this is basically a description of economic freedom. He later mentioned international trade as another leading cause that explained the wealth of nations in his book of that name. So we know that the countries that have the most economic freedom are significantly richer than other countries. There is a strong correlation between economic freedom and prosperity. There is also a strong correlation between economic freedom and poverty. The most free countries in the world have almost got rid of extreme poverty. They have really tiny, moderate poverty, whereas the countries with the least economic freedom still have substantial sectors of their population mired in extreme and moderate poverty. And corruption. Again, using the Corruption Perceptions Index, we can see that the countries with the most economic freedom are the ones that have the highest degree of transparency out there, and there is also a very obvious correlation between these. Intrusive regulations is one of the topics that is mentioned in the research as a leading cause of corruption, a leading factor that is correlated, at least, with corruption. And this takes me to the work of Hernando de Soto back in the 1980s in Peru. He tried to, he set up a group of researchers, and they tried to register a textile manufacturing company, a small textile manufacturing company, and they went out to get every single permit to comply with every single requirement that the local government, the national government, the regional government will require. What did they find? It took them 289 days of administrative work at a cost of $1,231 back then in Peru, which was the equivalent of 32 minimum wages, to register the company in a legal way. Not only that, in 7 different instances, they had to pay a bribe because otherwise the process wouldn't move. Because that was part of the research. They say, we're not going to pay a bribe unless this is it, unless this is the end game. So in 7 different occasions, they had to pay a bribe. This is the researchers back then holding all the paperwork that was required to register a small textile manufacturing company. So the research of Hernando de Soto was seminal. It changed the terms of the debate, because Hernando de Soto said, look, we don't have high degrees of informality in Latin America, and let's remember that 1 out of 2 workers out there in Latin America are in the informal sector. And many people thought that people are in the informal sector because they don't want to pay taxes, they don't want to pay Social Security. And Hernando de Soto said, no, that's not the case. They are in the informal sector because the cost of formality, the cost of legality, are way too high. So the World Bank started in 2003 to publish a book, basically doing the same exercise that Hernando de Soto did in Peru in the 1980s, which is called Doing Business. And in the factor of how long it takes to start a business, we see that Latin America, even though it's no longer hundreds of days, but Latin America is still the region of the world where it takes the longest, on average, to start a business. But look at the countries of the OECD. Let's remember that the OECD is mostly developed nations. They're the ones where it takes the least to open a business. Johan Norberg, I don't know if you heard of him, a Swedish free market scholar, he says that if you live in a developed country and you want to become rich, you open a business. In Latin America, you need to be rich to start a business, because only the rich people can afford all the paperwork, all the red tape, hiring lawyers, hiring accountants in order to navigate the seas of bureaucracy in Latin America. And you know what happens to poor people? Well, they have to take it to the streets. They have to be in the informal market and try to make a living that way. Do you know how long it takes to register a business in New Zealand? 1 afternoon. Only one single process and 1 afternoon. And I wonder how many instances of corruption there is in just that one single procedure. Probably none. And how big is the informal sector in New Zealand? Probably it's almost non-existent. The total tax burden on businesses. We are told that businesses don't pay their fair share. However, we see that in Latin America, is along with sub-Saharan Africa, the two regions of the world where businesses pay the most percentage of taxes as a share of their profits. So again, the cost of legality, the cost of formality in Latin America are way too high. Several keys on the rule of law, because the rule of law, of course, is a very important component when we're talking about corruption. Gordon Brown is not necessarily an idol within libertarian circles, but he has one of the best phrases, one of the best quotes out there on this topic. He said that in establishing the rule of law, the first 5 centuries are always the hardest. And this is kind of discouraging for us in Latin America, since our republics only are 200 years. Of course, we didn't start from scratch. We came from a heritage of Spanish and Portuguese institution building, but still we have very mature democracies, very mature judiciaries and rule of law compared to other Western countries. And if you look at the Economic Freedom Index, this is interesting because we have data that goes back in some countries all the way to 1970, but in most countries starting from 1975 all the way to 2017. If you look at the groups on quintile, you see many changes. You see that sometimes countries come into the first quartile and then they drop and so on and so on. And if you look by topic, you see that there is a lot of changes. When it comes to monetary policy, for example, the sound money. Some countries 1 year are in the first quartile and then they have high inflation the next year and they drop, and the same goes with regulations, the same goes with international trade. The one area of economic freedom where they're basically the same countries in 1975 were the top 20 and in 2017 are the top 20 is the number 2 component of economic liberty, which is rule of law and secure property rights. That is, there is very little movement in that particular component of economic liberty, which makes Gordon Brown's admonition pretty certain. We have to keep in mind that in the West, and when I mean the West, I talk about, of course, Western Europe and North America, the rule of law consolidated itself before the arrival of democracy. However, in Latin America, this evolution is taking place in the context of electoral processes prone to populism. The institutions of the rule of law were already in place by the early 20th century. If we understand democracy as universal suffrage, let's keep in mind that only came to be in the 1910s and the 1920s when women were allowed to vote. Before that, we cannot claim that we had democracies. But by then, these countries in Western Europe and the United States and Canada were already full-fledged countries with rule of law institutions. Now in Latin America, we have a challenge, which is building rule of law institutions, that is an independent judiciary, secure property rights, etc., in the context of electoral processes, every 4 years, every 5 years, every 6 years, where candidates promise things, when candidates promise to attack judges, etc., and that's quite a challenge that we need to face. In the West, the institutions of the rule of law developed to protect the liberty of the individual, not to consolidate the power of the states. From Magna Carta on, you see that all the instruments that we relate to rule of law were meant to protect the individual from the abuses of power by government, by the ruler, etc. However, in Latin America nowadays, if you look at the debate everywhere, institutional strengthening doesn't mean protecting the individual. It means giving more powers to the state. When we talk about corruption, in many cases, people talk about giving the authorities powers to violate banking secrecy laws, for example. I don't know how you call here, in Portuguese, how you mention extinción de dominio. Extinción de dominio is a figure that has become really popular in Mexico, Central America. Argentina just passed it, which means that when it comes to fighting corruption and drug trafficking, if you cannot prove to the authorities that your your goods, your assets have been acquired legally, then the government can take them away, which is basically like reverting the principle that you're innocent until proven guilty. Well, extinción de dominio is becoming the new norm in the fight against corruption and drug trafficking, and that is, of course, detrimental to the rule of law. It's not actually empowering the rule of law. And in the West, the evolution of the rule of law took place with the consolidation of capitalist societies, where the size of government, measured by the levels of public spending, was limited. That is, again, if we look back at the early 20th century, when you already have rule of law in these countries, and in Western Europe, and in the US and Canada, you will notice that public spending in most of these countries was 10% of GDP, 15% of GDP. Now, in our countries, that's not the case, where we have, in the best case scenario, countries with 20% of GDP public spending, but all the way up to more than 40%, as in the case of Brazil. Corruption also has an associated threat, which is populism. Populism and corruption feed each other. Populism uses corruption to dismantle democratic institutions. And once it does that, the populace always installs a new corrupt elite around himself or herself. And that's why not only we have to worry about the effects of corruption on economic growth, but also we have to worry about the effects of corruption in the health and continuity of democracy itself. Here, there is an ammunition for classical liberals and libertarians. We tend to criticize politicians all the time. But we need to be a little more nuanced. We need to be a little more sophisticated in our criticism of politicians, because not all politicians are bad. Some are worse than others. And in that case, public cynicism against political class, against the political class, is dangerous for democracy. And democracy, as Winston Churchill said, is the worst system except for all the rest. Some final thoughts. Corruption is generally an effect, not a cause. It's the effect of having an intrusive government. The concentration of power in the hands of politicians and bureaucrats engenders corruption in our societies. And I emphasize in our societies. Again, let's look at the institutional reality around us. If people claim that in Sweden it works, well, we're not Swedish. In Latin America, blaming corruption, and this is another feat of corruption that we need to take particularly attention to. In Latin America, blaming corruption is increasingly becoming a scapegoat to avoid the need for structural reforms. What do I mean with that? I remember when you had the fuel rise, the rise in the price of fuels here in Brazil. When was that? 2 years ago, when Temer raised the price of gasoline, and then you had the trucker strike. And I was reading the reactions of the people, because the trucker strike was very popular. People were supporting the truckers. And the reaction was that, well, if only politicians stop stealing money, we don't need to get rid of subsidies. And that's becoming increasingly common all over Latin America. If only politicians stop stealing money, we don't need to reform the pension system. If only politicians will stop stealing money, we don't need to get rid of wasteful government subsidies. Well, that's not the case. We need these structural reforms, regardless of corruption. And that's one of the threats that I think in the public debate, corruption, a pervasive problem that we're having right now. Corruption is helping the populace make the people believe that everything will be good, everything will be sustainable, no matter what, if only, quote unquote, politicians wouldn't steal. And that's a challenge that we need to fight in the years ahead. So that's my presentation. Thank you very much. And of course, I'm open to questions and whatever observation you want to make. Thank you.
I'll give you the chance to ask a question if you want to do so. Yes.
Vou falar em português e depois alguém traduz. Eu vou falar devagarinho. Como é que tu enxergas esse último comentário que tu fez sobre o problema das democracias latino-americanas, né? Especialmente o que aconteceu na Argentina, na última eleição, né, que de novo foi eleito um peronista, e o que está acontecendo agora no Chile, porque a gente vê os comentários aqui no Brasil, na imprensa brasileira, são comentários que levam a crer que seja um problema do neoliberalismo.
Sim. Obrigado. Well, we can spend the whole afternoon here discussing Argentina and Chile. I think it was Simon Kuznets, that said that there are 4 types of countries. You have developed countries, developing countries, Japan, and Argentina. So, well, what happens in Argentina? Of course, Macri inherited a mess. One of the problems with Argentina is that Macri didn't win the election with a narrative of explaining to people this kind of adjustment that was needed for the economy to be back on track. Yeah, so, for example, he didn't talk about privatizing all the enterprises that the Kirchners nationalized. He basically told, and I remember, I talked to a pollster who is a friend of mine in Argentina prior to the election of Macri. And he said, dude, we have a problem here in Argentina. The problem is that people are not particularly upset with the policies of the Peronistas. They just don't like the roughness and the corruption, you know. And he used a quote, and I'm going to repeat it. We don't want to go to paradise by a kick in our ass, he said. That was what people in Argentina. So when Macri came to power, well, some people can be generous in the analysis. He didn't have the support of Congress. He didn't have a majority of Congress. He knew that the unions are particularly strong in Argentina and they could topple him. And he came with the background that non-peronist presidents never finished their term. I mean, in 100 years, all the non-peronist presidents are kicked out of office before they finish their term. So he tried to adopt gradualism in order to clean the economy. The problem is that it didn't work. I mean, the mess was of such a magnitude that it didn't work. What happens? Once things start going wrong, which is May last year, when we had the first devaluation of the peso, it was devalued by 25% or 20% in a week. And then people start fleeing and taking their savings out and turning their pesos into dollars. And we went from having an exchange rate that was 20 pesos to having, like, I think it's 70 already. Everything was going to hell, you know. So they signed the IMF agreement. But if you look at every single indicator, Argentina is worse now than 4 years ago. And that's the simplest question in an election. Are you better off now than 4 years ago? You remember that was, I think, Ronald Reagan's campaign slogan. Are you better off now than 4 years ago? Well, if you look at exchange rate, poverty levels, incomes, economic growth, even the fiscal deficit, Argentina is worse off now than 4 years ago. So Argentinians weren't particularly convinced about the policies of Macri in the first place. And now looking at the results, they're like, well, we would just go back to the Peronists, you know. So I think there is a simple explanation of what happened in Argentina there, you know. It's not as simple as I will try to present, but there is a simple. When it comes to Chile, that's when you need to be a psychiatrist to understand what is happening in Chile. I don't think that economists or political analysts can give you a good read of what's happening there. You have the most successful country in Latin America by every single standard you use, every single one. You know, in 2014, 14 or 15, I was asked to debate in Washington Sergio Vittar. Sergio Vittar was a minister of Allende, he was a minister of Ricardo Lagos, and he was a minister of Michelle Bachelet in her first government. And we were invited to debate the economic model, the Chilean economic model. And you know, it's kind of intimidating for me to be debating a minister, a former minister of Chile, and I'm not even a Chilean. But one by one, it was like being in a baseball game. You know, one by one, he was throwing arguments about inequality, about lack of access to education, about the lack of access to healthcare. And one by one, I was like, boom, 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 with data. Well, look at the data, look at the data, look at the data. And finally, what he said is, you know what? Screw the data. We need to get rid of the Chilean, of Pinochet's Chilean model. So it's a thing about how the model came to be. It's not about its record. And what you see the people in the street, which are mostly young, people who don't recognize that Chile back in 1975 was 50% poor, 500% inflation, lack of goods, and you have shortages. It was Venezuela. Back then, Chile was a Venezuela in Latin America. Young people don't realize that. They are the keys of success. They're the keys of a prosperous society. And what they're demanding is a new constitution. And they claim that the constitution cannot be amended, which is not true. It has been amended 200 times since Pinochet left power. And when you ask them particularly, what is it that you want to change of the constitution? Because then the constitution can be amended. No, we want a new constitution. We want a constituent assembly. And we know how constituent assemblies end up in Latin America. So Chile is extremely frustrating for classical liberals because we've been talking about Chile for so long as the example to follow, as the role model, and now people are claiming, look, the Chilean model failed. It hasn't failed. Also, I think we lost the narrative. We cannot, people in Chile, the people who defend the model, the people who created the model, thought that the model will defend itself with results. The people will defend and will see the virtues of the model by looking at how incomes are rising, and yeah, that's not the case. You have a generation being indoctrinated that was indoctrinated in public universities mostly, but not only public universities, many private universities too. They were indoctrinated against the model. I've been to Chile many times. I've been to palestras like this in Chile, and I was scared, even in private universities, to see the reaction. When I show this, the similar presentation, people will be foaming, like from the mouth, you know, against neoliberalism. So sooner or later what's going to happen? The last visit I made to Chile was a month before the election of Piñera. And I was having drinks with some colleagues and classical liberal colleagues, and they warned me, if Piñera wins, you're going to have people in the streets the next day trying to topple him. It didn't take it wasn't the next day, it was 2 years later, basically, but the premonition was made real. The other day I was and I'm going to finish. The other day I was in a TV show, and they asked me about Uruguay. How come Uruguay is so stable? You don't see riots in Uruguay. You don't see protests. You don't see nothing. And my reply was, well, because they have left-wing governments. Let's see what happens when the right comes back to power now in November. I bet you that within a year, we're going to see riots in Montevideo. We're going to see people burning cars and businesses and all that, because unfortunately, that's the way the left works.
Well, I have a question here. First of all, thank you for your talk. It's very nice. It's very interesting to see a Latin American perspective. Well, here in Brazil, I'm a practicing lawyer and I work in the Economic Center. Well, you mentioned in your presentation that we have some sort of a legal and non-legal corruption. And when you are dealing with electoral law, when you're dealing with a legislative process, it's quite hard for us to draw the lines when you are in the middle of the process, you see. How would you draw the lines to understand what would be considered a bill that is protecting legal corruption, and how we are to avoid this kind of situation?
You mean like electoral laws and campaign finance and all that?
How, for example, here we have some sort of funds for the electoral process. And we have some sort of salaries for representative to buy nice tweets, to use cars. So you see, when we are discussing theoretically, it's easy to understand your point. But how, in a more practical way, we should understand and avoid the situations when making the law?
Yeah, that's an extremely difficult question. Because again, it's not that we can look at what works best. It's not like we can look, oh, let's see what happens in Sweden and we can copy it. No, that's not the way our societies work. Again, let's keep Buchanan and Wagner in mind. In Costa Rica, it's the same, for example. In Costa Rica, the government is extremely generous giving funding to the parties. And it doesn't check the expenditures. If I, for example, I'm a candidate and I come to the electoral tribunal after the campaign and I say, I rented a car. I rented this 1987 model for $5,000 a day. The only thing that the tribunal does is checking with the owner of the car to make sure that the car was rented. It doesn't look at it was $5,000 a day, you know, for a 1987 model. So that happens all the time, and it's all over the media. You know, every 4 years there is a scandal about campaign finance. Waste and all that stuff. But then politicians say, well, this is the price of democracy, you know. If we didn't have public funding for campaigns, not drug traffickers and shady businessmen will be giving money to politicians. But that also happens. So what's the line? Where do you draw the line? Where do you say, well, we're going to limit some contributions, we're not going to... I have no idea. That's something that really needs to look at, need to be looked at, but I have no idea, like the silver bullet say like, okay, this is what needs to be done. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
One here. Can you tell a little bit about Peru? Because a couple of years ago, when I was in presentation, there was Peru would be the next Chile. But before Chile is facing several problems about corruption, and Paulo Kuczynski was resigning from the government, and all the problems, and then it seems to be that return back to the populism against the type of policy that was Chilean inspired. Can you talk a little bit?
Well, one of the things with Chile that made Chile successful, at least we thought, is that the left believed in the model. After Pinochet left, there were 4 successive governments of the Concertación, left-wing governments, that not only kept the model but keep pushing for more reforms. If you look at Chile's economic liberty grade after 1990, it keeps improving, which means that the left was convinced of this model. The same was in Peru. In Peru, there is also like an illegitimate birth of the reforms, which was Fujimori, a perceived dictator. But if you look, the successive governments kept the model. Even when Ollanta came to power, many people were concerned that he was going to be another Hugo Chavez. No, he appointed a classical liberal as prime minister, and a good friend of the Cato Institute. And all the finance ministers are very well respected and other stuff. So yeah, then politics in Peru is a mess. I mean, it's one of the most dysfunctional countries in Latin America. But that doesn't have an impact on the economy, or didn't have an impact on the economy until now, when you reach the point where all the former presidents are in jail. Well, one of them killed himself for corruption. Well, yeah. When you have the case that a president is impeached because of corruption and had to resign, then that's having an impact on investment, that's having an impact on corruption itself. One of the good things about the Odebrecht scandal in Latin America is that it served as a metric to see how functioning institutions were in several Latin American countries in the fight against corruption. So of course, Brazil was the epicenter of the Odebrecht scandal, but also was one of the countries that was most effective exposing the corruption and fighting against the corruption. But then we see Peru.
And partially of the corruption is connected
Yeah, it's the, I mean, it's the same. It's the same. It's the same. Either Odebrecht or OAS. You know, Transparency International said that Brazil was exporting corruption all over Latin America for 15 years, which is true. But then we see that Peru was, after Brazil, the country that was most effective fighting corruption. Now, the complaint is actually that they went a little overboard. You know, that, for example, preemptive prison for Kuczynski for 3 years. Preemptive prison is an extraordinary measure. You only take it when the suspect is violent, or there is a threat that he will escape, or is a threat that he will interfere with the investigation. But giving a sentence of 3 years of preemptive prison to someone, that's basically condemning it without a trial. And that's very common in Peru. So now the complaint in Peru is that the authorities are actually pushing too hard against suspects of corruption. But then you have other countries that we know for a fact that receive billions of dollars in bribes, like Panama, Dominican Republic, Mexico, where nothing happened. Not a single person is in jail. Not a single name has been exposed. So if there is anything good that can come up of the whole Odebrecht scandal, is that we can see, as like a kaleidoscope, which countries has stronger institutions and more effective institutions to fight corruption than others. And one of them, is curiously enough, is Peru.
Are there any more questions, comments? Okay, one there.
Do you think if there's any chance of what is happening in Chile come to Brazil or other countries in Latin America?
Well, I don't think so. I think Chile is a very particular case. Chile, I mean, you had the protest in, what was it, 2013? 13, 15. But what we saw afterwards was a rise of the middle class here in Brazil, but it wasn't a middle class that was demanding free stuff. It was a middle class, and this is my reading, you correct me, it was a middle class that was demanding better public services. They were saying, we already pay a lot of taxes. We want better transportation, better sanitation, better education, you know, and less corruption. Whereas in Chile, you have a middle class that feels rich, and they feel Scandinavian, and they think, why is it that us, being a successful country, have to pay for going to college? Why us, as a successful country, cannot get free healthcare? Why cannot we get free education, et cetera, et cetera? So I think it's a different set of demands there. One of the interesting things about Chile is that, yeah, I mean, so people, the other day I was having a discussion, and people, somebody told me, well, it's just that the pensions in system in Chile are too low. And then I pointed at an article that shows that if you work 35 years or 40, and you contribute to your private pension, your pension is going to be $1,000 in Chile, which is not bad. It's higher than the average in Latin America. And somebody replied and said, well, but nobody works 35 years to 40 years, you know? And I was like, well, what do you expect? Do you expect to have a generous pension without contributing to it? Do you expect to have a generous pension working just 20 years? And you're going to be retired for 25 years? And this is one of the interesting things about the Chilean model. Yes, I mean, expectations are out of control in Chile. They think that everything can be achieved, you know, if the government just gives stuff for free. But one of the interesting things about Chile is that they are not inheriting a debt to future society. I mean, if you look at public debt in Chile, it's 25%, and it has been rising in the last 10 years, but it's 25%, it's under control. Pension system, there's no debt to future generations. So yeah, in Latin America, maybe we can have generous pensions for people who haven't worked enough, but guess who's going to pay them? The next generations, because the system is going to be bankrupt. And yeah, that's another factor in the Chilean discussion that we need to keep in mind. No, I don't see that there was a parallel between Brazil and Chile. Of course, there might be a parallel that in Brazil, and correct me if I'm wrong, the perception was that all politicians were corrupt and that a major change was needed. That gave the rise to Bolsonaro. In Chile, there might be the same impression that all politicians are corrupt, are the same, even though corruption in Chile, according to Transparency International, is the lowest in Latin America. But that might give the rise to a populist in Chile. We don't know.
But you don't think these demonstrations could come to Brazil or other countries in Latin America?
You know, if you had asked me a month ago that there was going to be a major crisis in Chile, I would have said, nah, give me a break. So I'm not going to predict. I want my integrity and my wisdom to be intact, you know. Every time I predict something, it goes wrong, so no.
Do we have any more questions or comments? Okay, we have two here.
No, I want to be the devil's lawyer now. Liberalism is really a good idea, but there are some points that I want to talk. Like here in Brazil, we have the fight, the rich against the poor, the left against the right, and it seems that we are just turning around and round, and we don't go. We don't have so much benefits of it, you know. Which way liberalism should go to go away from this liberalism is only for rich people, is only for they don't have the natural, the rule of law, the fight of this. No, just I want your opinion.
Well, we certainly have to do a better job at communicating ourselves. It's very frustrating. I've been a libertarian for 20 years, and I've seen this debate go on and on and on. How can we be more effective in communicating our ideas? I think Nigel gave a talk before, but I think that our opponents are particularly skillful at framing the terms of the debate. For example, look at Chile. Now they're presenting Chile as a total failure when it's not a failure. They're talking that Piñera is a dictator when it's not a dictator, you know. They're talking about that there are people rising up, you know, which is not rising up. They're just looting and rioting. And for some reason, we are always struggling to convey our ideas in a more effective way. Just look at the evidence. I mean, those societies that embrace these ideas, this framework, are the most successful. Those are societies where the poor are better off. It's where you have higher social mobility. When people are born poor, have more chances of going up in the social ladder. But unfortunately, the hard evidence doesn't explain itself. So it needs better communicators. We have to be better communicators. And I think that, again, and this is not, I'm not biased because I'm going to go into politics next year in Costa Rica, but we need people in the political arena also that bring this message. We cannot leave liberalism to career politicians. We need to have people who are convinced of these ideas going into the political realm.